Hello, I'm Cynthia Houston, a grad student in the Department of Communication and Journalism at the University of Maine. I'm also a participant in the university's National Science Foundation Research Traineeship Program in Conservation Science. Today, I will present preliminary findings of team-based research that explores stakeholder risk and benefit perceptions related to Maine's land-based aquaculture projects. Our research is being conducted jointly by the University of Maine and Decision Research. In 2018, several Maine news outlets published stories that U.S. and international companies had identified several Maine communities as prime locations for a recirculating aquaculture system, also known as land-based aquaculture or simply RAS. These proposed RAS structures were to be built on a scale not previously attempted anywhere in the world. As the planning and permitting of these Maine-based RAS sites progressed, very different community responses emerged. Different towns, for example Belfast and Bucksport, made different distinctions about the risks and benefits of welcoming RAS into their community. Our research seeks to understand those distinctions. As we began our research, we quickly recognized that RAS was on the verge of reshaping the field of aquaculture well beyond local Maine communities. At the state level, Maine's Economic and Community Development Plan for the years 2020 through 2029 welcomed land-based aquaculture to drive the state's economy. RAS also appeared on the national agenda. Executive orders were being passed and policies updated to aggressively promote the U.S. aquaculture sector and to reduce the existing aquaculture trade deficit. Internationally, we found that increased efficiencies in RAS technology were bolstering a surge in proposed RAS facilities. Locations ranged from the United Arab Emirates to Sweden to Japan. We understood at that point that our research on RAS siting in Maine could result in lessons learned that could be applied to the industry as a whole. So what's the ingeniousness of RAS? What does it look like? This new approach to aquaculture is to locate aquaculture production in multiple highly controlled tanks in a facility on land. Using fish as an example, this land-based approach allows cultivators increased control over fish habitat and water quality. It offers a high degree of control over fish production from egg to harvest. A percentage of the water in this type of aquaculture system is recirculated. A literature review found that, in general, there were low levels of both factual and subjective knowledge among North American audiences on the topic of aquaculture. Most individuals perceive some risk and some benefits of aquaculture. However, most people are unfamiliar with RAS, though this might not be the case in Maine. The literature review found that almost no studies exist on the perceptions of RAS, and none were identified that focused on RAS in the United States. Research showed that a key factor in understanding public support for or opposition to novel food technologies was perceived naturalness. This was in comparison to food production that was perceived as highly engineered. Applying this, the perception of naturalness of food production could shape opinion of fish harvested from a RAS. Our literature review additionally showed that in order to make judgments about the acceptability of aquaculture in their communities, and in the absence of sufficient information, members of the public may rely on analogies to terrestrial agriculture. This included perceptions of risk to natural resources or risk to animal welfare. We received funding through NOAA for a 2-year study supporting our proposed research. Our NOAA grant supports analysis of community and stakeholder reaction to proposed RAS siting over several geographically disparate communities in the United States. These include Bucksport and Belfast, Maine, the Samoa Peninsula in Humboldt County, California, and Homestead, Florida. Our research explores RAS dynamics through the theoretical lens of both perception and communication. We are collecting data at the micro, meso, and macro scale to examine how factors at each scale influence community and stakeholder response. Today we will present preliminary findings for 2 of our research questions. The findings presented today are specific to the RAS facilities proposed in Maine. We pose the following research questions. How do key stakeholders in each community perceive the relative benefits and risks associated with RAS? Our second research question is to ask, to what extent is RAS perceived as natural? Our data collection to date has included interviews ranging from community members, advocacy groups, RAS corporate officials, journalists, and policymakers. Our methodology is semi-structured, in-depth interviews conducted across a broad range of RAS constituents. As of March 10, 2021, we have interviewed 31 individuals in our Maine-specific research. We adopted a grounded theory approach, executing team-based qualitative coding of interview transcripts. We followed the constant comparative method, and emerging results informed subsequent data collection and analysis. The next few slides will present several emergent themes from our interviews to date. Our stakeholder interviews demonstrated an emergent theme related to the idea of relative restoration of the environment. Some interviewees provided this feedback within the context of moving from a paper mill industry to a RAS industry. For example, some Bucksport interviewees perceived their town as a brownfield site, and RAS was perceived as going in the right direction. There was a notion relayed by some interviewees that prior industrial areas had already been sacrificed, and that installing an RAS was a productive way to move forward and build upon pre-existing infrastructure. As a result, risk perception was dampened in these contexts. In comparison, perception was split in Belfast. Some interviewees perceived Belfast to be a greenfield and felt RAS was a risk and could cause environmental damage. However, other Belfast stakeholders remembered the town's history of poultry farming to include that industry's natural resource damage to the Gulf of Maine. A member of the municipal government in Bucksport states, "So this was a brownfield site in Bucksport. So when you talk about clean and renewable and better for the property, it's gone from a tannery, which was probably one of the worst things to have, to a paper mill, which was better, to land-based. It's gotten better." Some interviewees held negative perceptions of net pen aquaculture based on prior knowledge of that aquaculture method. These individuals saw a benefit in a shift to land-based aquaculture. They perceived RAS as environmentally beneficial and a trend toward a more sustainable aquaculture industry. An individual speaking on behalf of an advocacy group in Belfast states, "I thought maybe RAS is the wave of the future and that net pens are terrible, and we can't keep doing it like that." A second emerging theme was a perception among some interviewees that RAS is an unproven technology. These interviewees felt there is an inherent uncertainty with RAS. It is perceived as a risk, particularly as the technology has not been proven at the scale of the proposed Belfast and Bucksport facilities. Other interviewees were worried about the economic viability of RAS and were unsure about the benefit to their town from an economic standpoint. These individuals felt RAS economic risks to include unknowns in getting the fish to market, lack of universal acceptance of the vision of sustainable seafood, and risks in collaborating with investors outweighed potential benefits. An advocacy group member from Belfast states, "They say they're going to filter to 4 microns. Nobody's ever done that. How do you even know that you can take 33,000 metric tons of salmon poop and force it, that much water, through a 4 micron filter?" An RES advocacy member, very knowledgeable of the industry, states, "None of the land-based RES systems has ever been profitable, so these projects are going to test that." An RES corporate member relays that you can invest in a land-based fish farm, but you're not going to get a return on your money for 5 years. The third theme that emerged was a perception that the term RAS was used too generally or was used in a misleading manner. These individuals did not accept RAS as an environmentally friendly technology. There was increased perception of risk and resulting opposition as they realized how an RAS system operates, that it requires a source of water, that effluent is created and discharged, and that only a percentage of the water is recirculated. A tribal member states, "When you hear RAS recirculating, when I first heard that, I thought, oh great, there won't be any discharge because they are just going to keep recirculating the water and cleaning it and using it again. But that's not the case at all. There is a very large discharge, so that was a little bit misleading." The final emergent theme I will present today is that some interviewees defined a RAS facility as a concentrated animal feeding operation, or CAFO. A CAFO is a specific type of large-scale industrial agriculture facility that raises animals, usually at high density. These interviewees felt RAS should be regulated by agriculture regulations versus marine policy. Of these individuals, some saw land-based aquaculture and the density of fish in an RAS tank through the lens of animal injustice. These individuals were opposed to RAS due to ethical concerns and concerns that the facility could not be properly regulated. However, other interviewees perceived that RAS was a step up from a CAFO and would be a beneficial step toward food security. A member of Belfast municipal government states, "Well, the biggest benefits are clearly feeding the population. We need this. If it's done right, it's a much better way to develop protein than gigantic Western cattle farms. So that's terrific and can develop large quantities of very high nutrition food." In comparison, a member of an advocacy group in Belfast states, "Whether it's a feedlot in the Midwest for cattle, or a huge catfish raising operation in Alabama, or it's salmon raising on the Penobscot Bay, it's still an industrialized food production system." Next steps for our research include conducting additional interviews with Maine, California, and Florida RES stakeholders, and further development of our comprehensive codebook. We are currently fielding a community survey which asks complementary questions to our stakeholder interviews. Other elements of our research include media discourse analysis and public discourse analysis. For example, discourse analysis of public meetings and RES marketing materials. As we synthesize our research data, we hope our findings will support an increased understanding of how perception and contextual communication about RES will shape its advancement here in Maine and across the U.S. As I conclude, I would like to acknowledge this project's funding sources, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Science Foundation Research Traineeship in Conservation Science. I would like to acknowledge our collaborating partners, Sea Grant Maine and Sea Grant California. Finally, I would like to thank the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point Northern Aquaculture Demonstration Facility for the photos they provided featuring their RES operations. Thank you all for your interest in our research, and stay tuned for future findings.